Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome in Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 4
Saison 4, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
and in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Deponte, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci
Thank you
d'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, we are very happy at the beginning of Season 4 of Comme d'Archi podcast to conclude the cycle dedicated to the agency Leclercq Associés with today's theme of water. Water outside, water inside, the risk it represents and the benefits it brings to us if its flows are understood. This is precisely the work of the protagonist who spoke in our French interview. Mohamed Lotfi Belhouari, architect urbanist, director of the Urbanism and Landscape Division with Mathilde Adam of Leclercq Associés, Paris, France. And his guest, Christian Piel, director of the Urban Water Agency, located in the 11th district of Paris. Christian created and directed the agency Composante Urbaine for 20 years. His experience of more than 25 years in the integration of the water cycle in the urban environment has led him to develop urban water over the last 6 years by associating urban planning and water more closely and by including a new dimension, that of water as a support for nature in the city at all scales. He recounts, "Originally, it was a bit of a coincidence, even though I was trained as a geographer. It happens that at the end of my studies, I was in connection with a friend, the late Thierry Métro, for whom I have a deep thought. Both he and I found ourselves working in Seine-Saint-Denis for the Water and Sanitation Department for the département, which geographically is very vulnerable to floods, because it is a very flat department that drains an immense watershed whose urbanization has spread quite rapidly and which experienced increasingly important floods in the 1980s as urbanization developed. At that time, there was a current of thought that still exists, that of Bernard Chocat, a hydrologist, our master, who considered that these flooding problems were not related to sanitation. And yet, at the time, these floods created buried retention basins, generated civil engineering." End of quote. But what produced these floods? It was a runoff. What produces the runoff? It's the city. If you're going to intervene on flooding, you have to intervene not on these retention ponds. It is not by increasing the pipes, but rather by working on the urban fabric. And so Bertrand Chocat thought it was necessary to hire urban planners to think about this. He allowed Christian Piel and Thierry Métro to be hired at the water department, and that's when they started to think. They realized that it was very interesting, because the answers brought to think about the city as such, the structure, the texture of the city. That's how they specialized in hydrology internally, in the water department, and then as part of a continuing education program in Grenoble. "It was so interesting that I decided to make it my profession," tells Christian Piel. And Thierry Métro in another way, he adds. The fundamentals refer to the city that expands, the city that generates runoff, floods. But how to manage flooding? Christian Piel explains. "At the beginning, we worked a lot on the following question: how to create multifunctional spaces, sports fields, squares, etc. How to make them floodable in order to channel the flooding. At first, we were project managers, many project managers. Today, this approach has become widespread and we are not the only ones with these skills. So the more it goes on, the less we ensure project management, except for designing very specialized spaces that will allow water to be infiltrated and reused. Today, we are mainly involved in the development of water management strategies at all scales: the plot, the city, almost the region. This is also reflected in the regulatory aspect of all these problems of flooding and resources. How do we adapt? How do we play with these regulations in urban environments? So a lot of strategy, regulations, project management, and also a bit of research on what we can do with all this water. How to valorize this water? How to valorize the project with this water issue? We work a lot with Christian Piel, says Mohamed, on the theme of water, resilience, flood risk, but not only. I was trained by Christian. I learned a lot from him. To look at water differently, to read cities differently. This additional layer of water has many things to tell us. There are questions of slopes, furrows, geography. Behind water, there is the question of water as a resource that we need to preserve, because it is becoming more and more scarce. We experienced it again this summer with the dried up rivers, the images of apocalypses here and there, which remind us that our house is burning and that it is becoming very, very urgent. This question of water as a resource is fundamental in the design of cities. Mohamed adds, he has this idea that it is also the water identity. It is a source that has a name, it is a river, it is the Seine. There are communes which are on Vilaine-sur-Seine, Moret-sur-Loing. There are rivers of the places which gather. These sorts of linear watercourses have something to tell about the large territory and can be supports for projects and places of gathering. This is what interests us. At the agency, it is a subject that we deal with on several emblematic projects. In particular, Euro-Méditerranée with the renaturation of the Egalad stream, on the Plaine du Var Delta with the Grand Arena project, but others as well, both on a territorial scale but also on other scales. It is also at the scale of the public space. It is also at the scale of the building. That is to say, the water inside the building, the water which flows through the gutters, through the roofs. End of quote. At the Leclercq Agency, there is the example of the Wadi Martil Valley project in Tétouan, Morocco, developed with Christian Piel. This project demonstrates that each context, both cultural, political, social, is different. And the perception of water is not necessarily the same according to the different sites. On Wadi Martil, we had to provide technical assistance for a project that consisted of transforming and channeling a river to prevent the risk of flooding, because there are very violent floods in a strong Mediterranean context. The team carried the idea that, in the end, this transformation, the transformation of this wadi, could be done a little differently, in connection with both a certain nature, with its geography, by inventing public spaces maybe a little different. And so we sowed the seeds. I don't know if the project will continue like that or not, but it was a rather interesting moment for me, but also for the agency to be confronted with this type of subject, underlines Mohamed. Christian Piel adds, we could see that there was a watercourse that still had a rather natural functioning. That means that in the summer, very, very little water. And then, in the rainy seasons, there is perhaps a lot of water. So, there is a very strong water dynamic. And the approach that had been implemented was rather to try to control this water. So we said, we will put dams, we will put dikes, and outside the dikes, we will build. We have proposed to vegetate or to create uses that can tolerate more or less important floods. And that translates into landscape already in terms of geography, morphology, microtopography, geology, and also in terms of landscape and ecology, and in terms of architecture, because it is necessary to adapt the architecture and the city, and the framework and the structure of the city, so that these buildings can admit a potential flood. End of quote. There is another subject that has been close to the agency's heart for several years. It is that of Marseille Euro-Méditerranée and the Egalad stream. What is interesting about this stream is that you can walk along it. It is a linear structure that crosses neighborhoods, a strong geographical structure that goes from the Étoile mountain to the sea. This creek becomes a rather important place of identity for the northern districts. Mohamed specifies. In fact, What we have been defending for a few years now is that these creeks should finally become the great linear park of the northern districts, a guiding thread, a sort of great park, which is a vector of transformation for these districts. On our scale, in the Euro-Mediterranean sector, we are downstream. That is to say, we have almost arrived at the sea with the idea that we have been carrying for several years and that we have been developing with the BAS Landscape Agency, which we also developed with the TER Agency a long time ago. These creeks must open up, be revealed, given back to the inhabitants. It must become a space of pride and the main thread, the major element of the Egalad Park, much awaited by the people of Marseille. The questioning is also, how do the islands come to be positioned on the ground so that everything goes well in case of flooding? This is a theme that is dear to us. It is a rather exciting theme and carries a lot of positive things. Christian adds, "This creek is a good reflection of urban evolution. It was a stream that had a small flow because it drained natural hillsides. And then, as we urbanized, the flow and runoff increased. So it became a nuisance. So we covered it completely. And then it continued to create problems. It generates and carries more and more flow as urbanization increases. And now what's happening is the opposite. We are trying to put it back into its natural functioning. And what's interesting is that it's actually going to lay out a pathway along which a whole bunch of stories are going to be recreated. We are also trying to see how the watershed can be porous again to avoid generating runoff. So it has an impact on the upstream part, on the urban morphology upstream, and then on the lower part, we give it back a major bed. In this park, there will be the minor bed, and then there will also be the major bed, so we find natural functioning. What is interesting is that the Leclercq Agency also had Météo France work on the impact that this resurgence of water can have in the urban environment. The fact that there is this water in the urban environment, which is close to the sea, how can it generate currents that will have a bioclimatic impact that will allow the cooling of the city? You see, we are really moving from a risk management constraint to solutions that deal with flooding, with water resources, but also with the climate. So it's really a question of recovering all the natural metabolisms that were originally in a rural fabric. We are going to reintegrate them into an urban fabric. We accompany urbanization, we reintegrate ourselves into urbanization, but this time not in a concurring way, but modestly by saying, we will respect the natural functioning and we will take advantage of it. End of quote. Mohamed concluded, I would say that rivers, streams, canals are extraordinary, formidable places which manage to federate, which manage to gather us. Everyone is sensitive to them, and making them real project themes is something that we have been working on for a few years, and it is a subject that we love to deal with and that we want to pursue. And at several scales at the same time. At the territorial scale, the urban scale, the architectural scale. So it's really multi-scale. And there is a real project tool that also responds to the emergency that we are experiencing today. Christian Piel adds, I want to say the same thing but with other terms. All these subjects that we are discussing are not basically the domain of the hydrologist. In reality, the actors who will be able to intervene are the architects, the urban planners who have this global vision and who can make sure that all the actors of the development play their role. But everyone has an important role to play, even the person who installs the gutter, even the landscaper, even the VRD design office. All the players must be involved in this problem. So it is not just the hydrologist or even the VRD design office that should be involved. It is really all the actors of the development who have their role to play. And to respond to this constraint, and above all, to take advantage of it. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in to this urban journey along the water. See you next Monday for a new issue in French. Until then, take care and goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Thanks to Julien Rebourg, sound engineer, who is collaborating with us today. Don't forget to tune in to our previews on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, don't hesitate to promote it by giving it 5 stars and a little comment on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast platform. And above all, subscribe to listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.